There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to K-Tropathon and welcome to an interview with Blaine Harden. Hello, Blaine.
Hello.
Or should I call you Mr. Harden?
You can
I'm much
call me Blaine.
okay. Am I being involved with Korean things makes me think, oh, I should be calling him Mr. Harden. That's
No,
like the hierarchy thing. But
yeah.
anyways, um, so today we're going to be talking quite a bit about North Korea. Mr. Harden has written three books. It's three books, right?
Three books.
Three books that um, are about North Korea in different ways. They're about different people who've been involved with North Korea. Two of them were Koreans. One of them was an American spy. Is that right?
Right. And then for the Washington Post, I wrote about about North Korea almost exclusively for 3 years. And so for the past 12 years, I've been sort of either doing journalism about the Koreas or writing books about them,
Hmm.
nonfiction books.
Hmm. So some would say you're an expert on the topic.
Well, I'm an expert on parts of the topic.
Mhm.
There's a whole world of North Korean experts who focus on various aspects.
Mhm.
And my focus has been sort of on the nature of the Kim family regime and how it rose to power and how it sustains power.
Mhm. Mhm. That is a fascinating topic because so many people have like predicted the downfall of North Korea and it just keeps going. So you emphasized actually, I'm going off script a little bit. You emphasized in an interview on Fox that the Kims they have a method to the madness. Like it's pretty smart the way they are keeping their people in thrall. Like it's horrible and evil, but um it works.
Yeah,
Um,
I think the best way to understand what's gone on in North Korea is that the Kim family, they didn't invent totalitarianism. That was invented by Stalin, really,
mm,
and also by Mao. But what the Kim family has done through 3 generations is to perfect it and to, in a way, stop time itself from passing inside that state. And so the various levers of totalitarianism, closed borders, restricted media, control over all information, and attempted control over people's thoughts, has achieved a higher degree of success more consistently and longer than any other country in human history. It's
mm,
been going on for nearly 3/4 of a century.
mm,
And actually, the rules are more tightly enforced now than they may have ever been
mm,
under Kim Jong Un. So North Korea is a fascinating, dark, consistently unchanging place.
mm,
And for that reason, it's well worth the interest of Americans and people around the world.
mm, mhm, mhm. It's fascinating because in your biography of Kim Il Sung, it's Kim Il Sung, right?
Yeah,
And
the founding great leader.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I get the two older Kims confused in my brain still. But so Kim Il Sung and No Kum Sok, you wrote a biography of them. No Kum Sok is a North Korean who fled North Korea by stealing what is it, a MiG?
A fighter plane, a MiG fighter
Mhm.
plane. He was a young North Korean who was a teenager when Kim Il Sung rose to power in the 1950s and late 1940s, and he hated communism. He hated the restrictions, but he was a very smart guy. He died just last year. Um, uh, and what he did is he figured out the only way to get out of there was to find an escape module and to find which happened to be a MiG fighter jet, which he flew during the Korean War against Americans. But he needed to get access to that escape module, so he pretended
Mm.
very convincingly to be a communist believer, espousing the communist tenets and praising the great leader effusively and condemning all those who failed to do so. And so he rose into the system to become a trusted fighter pilot. And then he got on one of the got in one of those planes after the just a month after the end of the Korean War, and fired up the plane to 500-600 miles an hour and flew to South Korea, landed and said, "I'm here. Here's a MiG. I want to go to the United States." And after that, he did. He went to the United States, went to college, learned English, and became a successful aeronautical engineer for the rest of his life.
Just incredible.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy.
Yeah. What I didn't put this in the notes, but what made you want to put his story alongside Kim Il Sung's rise? Was it just because it was happening at the same time?
Well, they happened at the same time, and No Kum Sok wanted to escape because of Kim Il Sung.
Mm.
And the rise of North Korea, Americans had this sort of comic book understanding of the North Korean leadership. They dressed funny. They look, the the whole regime seems like a comic book from the outside. And what I wanted to do was to explain where the great leader came from and why he dressed up his state with this communist ideology to seize power, and how that worked, and then the role of China and of the Soviet Union and later Russia in sort of allowing him to seize power. In fact, it was the United States and the Soviet Union that created a divided Korea. It happened in the final days of World War II. The United States was worried that the Soviet Union, which was its ally during World War II, would march in and take the entire Korean peninsula. So a couple of mid-level military guys got together in the White House in just as World War II was ending and drew a straight line across the Korean peninsula, a line that had nothing to do with anything other than the line that they drew. And the top part was North Korea, the bottom part was South Korea. And as the years rolled by, the North uh, received guns and ideological support from the Soviet Union, from Stalin, and the South received guns and ideological support from Truman in the United States. And both superpowers selected puppet leaders they thought would be puppets.
Mm.
Uh, Kim Il Sung in the North, who is thought to be a pliant, cooperative guy who believed in communism, and in the South, Syngman Rhee, who the Americans hoped would be a compliant and cooperative champion of capitalism in the South. But neither of those guys were very cooperative or compliant. They were egotistic, brutal people who wanted to control the entire Korean peninsula and take over and use the guns and ideological window dressing of their patron as a way of supporting what their ego demanded, which was total dominance. And ultimately, that led to the Korean War, which ended in a stalemate that continues. There's no peace between North and South Korea to this date. And so that's sort of the big context for the situation on the Korean Peninsula. But what's happened is that South Korea, after the Korean War, slowly shed its authoritarian tendencies and became a real working democracy, a chaotic one. In fact, just the past year has shown that the current president was thrown out of office, and they're having another election next week. But it has one of the most dynamic capitalist systems on earth. It has like 65 million people, but I think the 11th largest economy in the world. our phones, the ships, televisions, so much of modern technology, car industry. South Korea is a dynamo, and it's a democracy. There's the free press. There's lively conversations about everything under the sun. And then in the North is this unchanging totalitarian state that has stopped time itself under three generations of the Kim family. The Korean Peninsula couldn't have two more different kinds of states than it has now. When during in the late 1990s, there was a famine in North Korea, and tens of thousands of people fled. Because the state sort of collapsed a little bit, the border guards collapsed. And so thousands of North Koreans, for the first time since the 1940s, fled North Korea into China and found their way to South Korea and started doing interviews with journalists like me. And they gave a first person account of the texture of life in North Korea for the first time. And when they came into South Korea from the north by way of China, it's as though they had gone a distance of a couple centuries of time. They couldn't understand what was going on in South Korea, which is an education obsessed, ultra modern techno society. And North Korea is a place where very often at night there's no light. Um, and so they do live in two different
No
worlds, one that's
internet.
changing all the time and one that is changing not at all.
Mhm. Oh man, thank you for that. That was a really great sort of context to the
Yeah,
situation for someone who might not have read your books yet, or maybe is sort of new to the topic.
yeah,
And actually, our theme for K-Dropathon this year is North Korea. So comparing the two is really interesting because in the past, we've always been focused on South Korea as our topic.
right.
But really, they should be one nation. There's no reason between the two of them that there should have been a split. It was totally arbitrary.
It was arbitrary. It was done by, the rising superpowers after World War II. But now the divisions have been they've lasted for three-quarters of a century, and it's very difficult for North Koreans if they do find their way to South Korea to survive.
Mm,
They struggle mightily to find work, to find social acceptance,
mm,
to find psychological contentment.
mm,
Rates of suicide, of depression,
mm,
divorce, and some people actually want to go back
mm,
because they're just so messed up by
mm,
coming to this place that's much more like America
mm,
in terms of the capitalist system than almost any place else in Asia or in the
mm,
world.
mm. And speaking of those North Korean defectors, you wrote a really famous biography of a man called Shin Dong-hyuk,
Yeah.
and that biography was called Escape from Camp 14. And that's actually our group book for K-Tropathon this year. So it's been what, a decade. Um in 2015 he made some changes to his story and it's been
Right,
about a decade since then. So has there
right.
been any updates since then?
He has not changed his story again.
Oh, good.
Um,
Okay.
the thing that with defectors, particularly those who are tortured when they're teenagers and young adults, is that their relationship to the truth, to a verifiable kind of story that would be used in a court of law or that an investigative journalist would be happy to use it's vague. People like Shin um, tend to tell a story that they believe their questioners want to hear.
Mm,
So they hide behind a story to protect themselves. They don't trust anybody. When Shin grew up, he was born in a concentration camp. His parents were actually selected by guards to breed, very much like hogs are selected to breed on a farm in Iowa. And he was the result of that experience. And his mother was not a particularly loving mother, and he betrayed his mother and his brother, and watched them executed, and told me that he felt nothing. And he did it in the hopes that he wouldn't be punished, and that he'd get more food. Um, but that was, early on in his development after he escaped, that he told me that. As time went on, he began to change his story. I worked with him for 4 years, and to before I wrote the book, and his story was unchanging at that time. It was the story that he told to U.S. intelligence, South Korean intelligence, to human rights groups around the world, to the Secretary of State of the United States. And it was a story that was consistent. And then later, as more people began to defect from South Korea, from North Korea to the South, some people emerged who knew that Shin's story was slightly different than what he'd been telling. And so I called him up and said, "Well, what's all this about?" And he panicked. He said that he was thinking about suicide. And so I rushed to Seoul and redid some of the book, explaining what was known about his change of story. And I also talked to people to psychiatrists who specialize in trauma of adolescence in wartime, trauma related to stress and torture. And what they agree, and what's now been accepted, I think, in understanding Shin and his story, is that if a story doesn't change from one of these people, they're probably not telling the truth, because their ability to perceive what happened to them is so distorted by torture and trauma that they really don't know what the truth is, and they can say several different versions of it and believe that that is the truth. It's a way of protecting themselves. But Shin's story is also verifiable because he had an expert understanding of the inner workings of the concentration camps in North Korea. And I talked to a dozen other people who were in the camps who said that Shin had a more precise understanding of how those camps work and what the geography of Camp 14 was than is conceivable for somebody who's lying. His body is also covered with scars from torture, which are consistent, according to former prison guards, with the kind of torture that the Bowibu, the special police that work in the guards, is the kind of torture that they use. So there's no doubt that he was there, that he was tortured, that he was created in one of those camps. And the inconsistencies and the changes of his story don't really discredit the descriptions of how the camps are run, which is pretty well documented. And the camps are quite visible on your phone if you want to look at them, and they have not gone away. They're still there. North Korea still denies that they exist, but they are a very important tool of repression. And I mentioned this idea of totalitarianism. The camps play this key role. Is a few 100,000 people have gone to the camps. Maybe between 60 and 100,000 are in them right now. But the threat that you would be sent there, along with your children and your parents, is always known. So it keeps people silent. It's a tactic of terror to intimidate people into silence, And those few North Koreans who don't stick with the program, who speak out, who whisper words of disloyalty to the Kim family, and those whispers are reported by a giant network of spies and informers across the country. Those people are then taken to the camps where they're not summarily killed, but they're worked to death with minimum amounts of food. And the knowledge that the camps are there is one of the tools that the Kim family has used for 3 generations to keep people in line.
Mm-hmm.
And
And it
that's why the camps are important, and that's why Shin's story is important.
Mhm. Mhm. It seems like you said, there have been other times where North Korean defectors have been, or like any trauma survivor has been questioned when their story changes or when they change their story. But if you look at the psychology of it, of course, if there's a detail that doesn't seem important to everybody else, like you don't think so, but it would protect you, something that feels very vulnerable about you,
Right.
you might try to just be like, oh, and skate over it. Like
Yeah.
Yeonmi Park did the same thing because she was sex trafficked in China, and she knew that if she explained that early on, she knew that people in South Korea would look at her differently
Right.
than they
Right.
ended up. So it
Right.
makes complete sense.
Right. There's a sense of shame about various aspects of their life that sometimes are hard to understand. In Shin's case, one of the tortures that he endured was the extract. Guards used pliers to pull off his fingernails, rip them off his hands. And the pain of that and watching them do that, it broke his spirit. And he cried. He felt like he'd been broken as a human being, and he has scars on his fingers from that. But he never talked about it to me until 8 years after I started talking to the guy. And I talked to him for hours and sometimes 20 hours a week about his life, uh, for months, and he would never talk about that. And then he did finally talk about it. And it was shame that kept him from talking about the way that the fingernail torture had tormented him. So I'm not sure that the story that he now tells about his life is any. It's actually more complicated and more horrifying than the original story. Um, and the experts on trauma and memory say that this is totally typical. And that was something that I didn't quite understand when I first wrote the book. And so that was a learning process for me too.
Yeah. There's only so much you can do,
Yeah.
you try to tell their, you try to let them tell their story to the best of their ability, and you record it to the best of your ability. But
And
this is
I did try to bounce his story off of other defectors, all the other defectors who were available in South Korea at the time, who believed that Shin was telling a true and more detailed story of life in the camps than had ever been told, but also from people who specialized in interviewing defectors in the human rights community around the world. And he was very much believed, and also by the U.S. and South Korean governments, who totally bought his story. So, the fact that it changed, I don't think it it discredits the importance of his testimony, or it certainly doesn't make those camps go away. And they're still there, they're still operating and still performing this essential tool of terrorizing the population into silence.
Yes, I mean, we should talk about the camps some more. So, um, what do you think? Do you think the purpose of the camps is basically to provide free labor for the government?
No, no.
No.
I mean, it does provide some free labor for the government. They make some uniforms, they grow some food. But slave labor is not a really efficient way to run an economy. What it does is it takes those few people whose conscience and character uh, uh, it makes them dissidents in North Korea, and it isolates them and it kills them.
Mm. So it
That's the
really is,
goal. Yeah. And,
it's a
Stalin invented these camps. The Gulag in Siberia was the model for what Kim Il sung created. And Stalin sent people off to the camps, and people died there from cold, from overwork. They weren't murdered. Um, the camps that the North Koreans operate work in pretty much the same way. People are worked to the point of breakdown. Their bodies break down. They don't eat very well. And if they misbehave or violate the rules, they're killed. Women are very often impregnated by guards and then murdered. There's very solid evidence of that. Um, but the overall purpose, as I said twice now, is to scare everybody else into sticking with the system. Totalitarianism is a difficult system to maintain. And what's important to understand is the Kim's family, through three generations, have been able to do that longer than any other state in human history. And it's stronger now than ever before. One of your questions that you're planning to ask me was about COVID. Uh, and in After there was a famine in North Korea in the late 1990s. That's after the Soviet Union turned into Russia and stopped giving subsidized food, fuel, and fertilizer to North Korea. The Being deprived of fuel and fertilizer caused a famine in North Korea and a general collapse of the system. And when that happened, people fled into China, but a parallel quasi-free market, scruffy street market system emerged in North Korea for the first time under the Kim family. And people could prosper by smuggling in clothes, radios, other stuff from China, which was, booming with a semi-capitalist controlled communist system. And North Korea started to become a different place. It was no longer completely under the thumb of the Kim family. There was a certain amount of wealth created by the free market system, this scruffy free market system of smuggling and selling stuff in the streets, that the Kim family didn't control. And in any totalitarian system, if the leadership does not control all the economy, they do not control all the minds. And so they got to stop it. And so this free market, street market system prospered and grew and became a parallel economy up until COVID. And then Kim Jong-un, who had been by that time in power for about 8 years in 2020, he used COVID as a way of crushing that street market system. What's happened is that the borders with China were essentially closed to try to stop COVID. It has since reopened, but the border now is controlled for official trade only, almost exclusively. And so people who had the ability to, sort of dash across the border, buy some clothes, some pants, some boots, some blue jeans, some DVDs, and then come back and sell it and make a living, that's ended. So life has become much more of a dark closet now since 2020 than it's been before, which is very good for the Kim family because it stops the influx of money, goods, and ideas that could destabilize the regime. So Kim Jong-un 75 years on, is just as powerful, and North Korea is just as isolated as it was in the late 1950s.
It it seems like the family, you mentioned it several times in the biography of Kim Il-sung and No Kum-suk, how Kim Il-sung would kind of take the changing situation and take what looked like a defeat and turn it somehow into a victory. And it seems like that's what happened with COVID. He's sort of he's making, Kim Jong-un is using it as a tool to close the border and keep his people in mental thrall.
Right. The Kim family has uh, an incredible capacity for cruelty
Mm,
to its own people. And normally, over time, that instinct for cruelty, the hunger for cruelty at the top, it
mm,
diminishes. New generations come, new thinking, but that hasn't happened in North Korea. Part of it is the neighborhood.
mm,
Um, you know, North Korea is sort of wedged between South Korea, which, as I've described, is this go-go American aligned capitalist uh, pressure cooker of ideas, of wealth, of ambition, um, and totally different than much of Asia. And
mm,
then China, and there's also a border with what is now Russia.
mm,
And China is very wary of the United States, more
mm,
so now than probably ever before.
mm,
And they like the idea of a buffer
mm,
between South Korea and China. The Northeast China used to be called Manchuria,
mm,
and a large percentage of the population that lives along the border with North Korea, those people are ethnic Koreans. They
mm,
speak Korean, they eat Korean food, and they have a longstanding Korean culture.
mm,
And they would be inclined, if all of the Korean Peninsula was South Korea,
mm,
this American aligned country, that they would prove to be a restive, troublesome population for the Chinese government in Beijing.
mm,
But by having this buffer of this cruel totalitarian state between itself and South Korea suits China.
mm,
And so China puts up with North Korea,
mm,
even though it's a pretty troublesome customer. You know, they now have 90, the capacity to make 90 nuclear weapons. They have the ability to deliver those weapons. They have one of the largest militaries on earth. They're now fighting, or they have fought in recent months for Putin's Russia against Ukraine.
mm,
Um, uh, it's a troublesome place for everybody in the neighborhood, but it suits China's interest, and it also now suits the interest of the Soviet of Russia and
mm,
Putin. They make lots of bombs and other artillery related weaponry in North Korea. Um, the military is the largest part of the economy, other than agriculture.
mm,
Um, and Putin needs shells. He needs people who will fight in his war against Ukraine. And so it suits the strategic needs of Russia and China to have North Korea continue to be what it is, this
mm,
unchanging totalitarian hellhole.
mm,
Uh, and that's one of the reasons it persists. And the last reason it persists is the Kim family knows that if they lose power, they are dead, that
mhm,
they will be, and the people around them will be imprisoned or killed.
mm,
Uh, they saw what happened in Eastern Europe in 1989, and there's hard information that they tried to make sure that that wouldn't happen in North Korea. And so far, they've been very successful. One of the things about covering North Korea is that it's kind of a boring story in that nothing ever changes.
Mm.
Um, the leaders die. I mean, the last really exciting thing that happened was when Kim Jong Un's father died at
Mhm.
68 or 69,
Mhm.
and then he took over. But he was not, and he is not, and he will not be a change agent. He's an agent of stability, of repression, of cruelty, and of closing the place off so that he can remain in power.
Man, yeah, there was, I think you talked in the book about potential changes that Kim Jong-un might make to North Korea. And so everybody was watching it to see if that would happen. But it doesn't sound like very much changed.
No, no, it's not in his interest, or the interest of the privileged people in Pyongyang to change the system,
Mm.
um, because money they don't control, ideas they don't control,
Mm.
is dissidence. And that's the beginning of the end for a totalitarian regime. They need to control everything.
Mm. You've used that term totalitarian quite a few times, and I'm curious, is communism considered totalitarian or
Not really, not really.
okay.
I mean, totalitarianism uh, evolved as the communist state uh, was created in the Soviet Union,
Okay.
but also under Hitler. It's a system of intense nationalism and militarism, um, uh, um, an isolation from the outside ideas. The belief, it's almost a religious belief in the power of the one great leader, the cult of personality around Stalin, around Mao, around the great leader. Um, they turn the state into the church, the only church, and the leaders are given godlike uh, authority and godlike power. You know, Kim Jong Un plays golf, and or Kim Il Sung, his father played uh, uh, golf and got a hole in one on every hole.
Yes,
Uh,
of course.
or whatever the impossible achievement was, he did it on the first try,
Mm.
and that's the way the system works.
Mm. Okay. I was really curious about whether you would say North Korea ever was communist and if it is now and when that might have changed because in your biography of Kim Il Sung it seemed like he bought into the idea of communism and he tried to sort of carry it out, but I wasn't sure if he was like a true believer or if this was just his means for taking control.
He was a young man in China. He moved to China when he was a little boy from North Korea, and this was a time when the Japanese imperialist system controlled all of the Korean Peninsula and most of Manchuria.
Mm.
And in the Chinese Revolution, led by Mao, who was a communist believer, and an ally of Lenin and Stalin's system. Um, Kim Il Sung grew up into that system and saw it as a ideological framework that would empower him in North Korea. And so he came into North Korea as a lowly. He was a member of the Soviet Union's military, uh, and a low-ranking member. And because he was willing to espouse the tenets of communism, to mouth them, not necessarily believe them, but to do what the Soviet masters told him to do, and to do it efficiently, um, he rose to power. And he had some legitimacy because he'd been fighting the Japanese, the hated Japanese imperialists who were vanquished after World War II. And because he had been an anti-Japanese fighter, he had actual populist credibility, street cred that no one else had in North Korea. So he married that street cred as an anti-Japanese fighter, which he really was, and he was fairly good at it at a small level, with an incredible appetite for sucking up to Stalin and praising Stalin and pretending to believe in communism. And by doing that, he rose to absolute power. He got guns, money, and food and fuel from the Soviet Union because he was so good at sucking up to Stalin. After Stalin died, he sort of changed, moved around a little bit, and managed to use his communist credentials to get money for rebuilding North Korea from the Soviet Union, from China, and from all these countries in the East Bloc, from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. They all sent him, tons of money and industrial capacity to rebuild North Korea. And as he rebuilt the communist system sort of evolved into a system of one-man control. And to call it communism is really not accurate. In fact, right now, the North Korea doesn't even call itself a communist state. It is it's a nationalist totalitarian monolith that gets some support from China, some grudging support from China, actually, because the communist leadership in China has always looked down its nose at the Kim family. Mao, in particular, is known to have said that Kim Il-sung, the great leader, was a number one pain in the butt. But they put up with him because North Korea is a good buffer, protecting China from the ethnic Koreans inside China and have this buffer from the South.
That is really interesting because I feel like in America, often, in fact, I've had this sort of fallacy, I guess, in my head that North Korea was like a communist, kind of like a Soviet era style communism. And I think the American political left and right will sometimes call it that and use it as like a football, political football in that way. At least it seems that way to me now, hearing you espouse the differences between like communism and like
Yeah,
what's actually
yeah.
happening, which is
I think communism is a kind of a useless way of understanding what that regime is. Um, it's a dictatorship built around one family and maybe 100,000 people who prosper because of their relationship to that family, most of whom live in the capital and have privileges that they are very much unwilling to give up. And they know if the system changes, that there'll be trouble. South Korea's economy is, it's exponentially bigger than the North. The North has nukes. It has this big army, and it has this will to power that doesn't change. The will to be cruel to its own people and isolate them, and perpetuates this standoff with South Korea and the United States, and it doesn't change.
wow. And you were talking about Kim Il Sung. So it sounds like he saw the opportunity to be a lasting figurehead, the way Mao and Stalin were, and he decided this is the opportunity to do that for myself.
Right. It's almost as though Kim Il Sung found eternal life through
Mm,
his son and grandson.
kind of.
Eternal life in the sense that nothing has changed in the system
Yeah.
since his death. He would recognize and be pleased with what's gone on. The system has evolved a little bit. They have an intranet for phones and for information. They have all these nuclear weapons. They have long range missile capacity. They have submarines. Um, so they have some technological advances. And the Korean people, North and South, are smart, hardworking people, and there are smart, hardworking North Korean scientists who've done a lot of work, and who get rewarded for it.
Mm,
Uh, but the rest of the economy is completely beholden to the Kim family. And
mm,
so problems with food security are chronic, health problems are chronic,
mm,
transportation, um, um, and basic consumer life is wretched. Like the privileged people of in Pyongyang, they live the really privileged people live a life that's very comparable to that of the average working guy in Seoul.
mm, mm,
Uh, and and the people of South Korea are bored by North Korea because as I say, it doesn't change. It's not. It's sort of 2 centuries ago in terms of its culture and economy and technology, and they're looking to sell electric cars to people in California. They're making a new technological world for themselves. The artificial intelligence and high speed computing and the best cars, best ships, best phones. They do all this stuff, and that's their focus, and on getting rich and living well. And so they live in a different universe from their cousins in the north,
mm.
and they're
Yeah.
not very interested in the north. Young people, particularly, who you would think would have, this moral. When a kid goes to college, they usually come home and tell their parents that their parents are too materialistic. They're not concerned about the right things to do.
Mm,
Well, young South Koreans don't think that about North Korea. They just don't focus on it. And that was always a puzzlement to me, but it's true. They are looking beyond that issue. Right now, South Korea vacillates between uh, electing presidents that are a little bit more antagonistic towards the North, and then electing presidents who are a little more conciliatory.
mm,
And it looks like the person who will win the election next week is going to be a little more conciliatory, trying to have peaceful conversations and family reunification and try to cool the temperature.
mm,
Uh, but neither side wants to go to war, in part because the nuclear weapons would destroy the peninsula.
mm.
Um, and so the tension is important for North Korea to maintain because it isolates their population and keeps the Kim family in control.
Fascinating. That is so interesting. Um, and you made like so many interesting comparisons in your book to kind of bring home the state of things in North Korea. And one of those that was really fascinating, you talked about um, the wall when East and West Germany became one, how South Korea is paying like really close attention to that because when if and when North Korea collapses and they become one again, um, it's going to be, let's see, how should I put this? I had never made that comparison in my mind. That was one of several really interesting comparisons you made.
I think that what's happened in the past 15 years since I wrote about that comparison, that North and South Korea have grown even further apart. Uh,
Mm,
North Korea is more isolated than it was. Its scruffy street market system has sort of been killed by Kim Jong-un.
mm,
Um, and so the chances of unification have diminished. Um, they really are, separate states that seem to be drifting in opposite directions. Uh, and so reunification as a goal for North Korea has been dropped.
mm,
Uh, and there was a big bureaucracy in South Korea that was devoted to organizing a possible reunification, and that too has sort of withered because it would be such a monumental task, and a lot of people in the North are true believers, and they would struggle mightily if there were a collapse of North Korea. I mean, it would happen. It would happen, and probably over a decade or two, but it would not be a smooth or easy transition. And the Kim family probably would not go down without a terrible fight.
mm. Yes. You met, so it's interesting because Um, do you think that that would be pretty much the only way that North Korea would see a dramatic change is if the people of North Korea stopped believing in this dynasty and like the miraculous element, so to speak?
Yeah, it would be. And that's why the place is closed. That's
Mm,
why the trade, money that's not part of the official economy is the street market system had to be shut down because it was a way to destabilize North Korea. And Kim Jong Un used COVID very, very brilliantly, strategically, to eliminate that threat to his power.
mm,
Uh, and also, as I mentioned, there were thousands of people who left North Korea between the late 1990s and 2010. Every
mm,
year they would find their way to South Korea. And once they arrived, then they would try to communicate with their relatives back in North Korea. There was a black market system of shuffling money
mm,
and of sending bribe money to extricate other family members out of the North into the South. It was
mm,
possible that if you had $10,000 in 2010 to take that $10,000 and get somebody out of North Korea in a few weeks.
mm,
Um, the black market, um, the underground market was thriving and a big part of North Korean life. Kim Jong Un has crushed that. Now,
wow.
almost no one leaves North Korea. Maybe a couple hundred a year
Mm,
escape, probably fewer than that. But it used to be
mm.
several thousand a year. Um,
Interesting.
so it's more hermetically sealed than it has been for several decades.
Even over the border to China, over
Yeah.
the two.
Yeah. So maybe what I said at the beginning of this conversation that the Kim family has stopped time
Mm.
moving forward. Actually, Kim Jong Un has turned the clock backwards.
Wow. That is really sad to hear. There was like some hopeful tones reading Escape from Camp 14 because it sounds like people I didn't realize like that people on the border between China and North Korea were like many of them were ethnically Korean and they were like sending DVDs over the border, of Korean South Korean dramas and like I'd heard some of that um but that it sounds like that has slowed to a trickle, almost not happening at all these days
That's
with
right.
COVID.
But satellite imagery shows that the camps have some of the camps have been rebuilt, like Camp 14 seems to have expanded,
Oh no.
um, and new construction, more people. Uh,
Mhm.
and of course, North Korea continues to deny that the camps exist.
Wow.
And the world focus on North Korea, the repression, the human rights situation, it waxes and wanes. It usually increases when there are new defectors who tell appalling stories, like Shin.
Mm-hmm.
But those new defectors who tell appalling stories aren't escaping the country anymore. Uh,
What a shame. What a shame. Is there anything that like average people can do? You said in an interview that, you can just Google North Korea blog now and you can become informed by reading online, and there's some great resources and stuff.
yeah.
Is there anything else that, like, say, a normal American can do, or do we just stay informed,
Well,
basically?
I think you can stay informed. There are some groups. There's the Liberty in North Korea, which is a California-based NGO that probably is has emerged as the most important. They help to educate North Koreans who escape. They
Mm-hmm.
try to get information into the country. I think if you wanted to donate to any group, that would be a good. It's called the initials Link, LINK. You can look it up on the internet. And there's another group that I think does great work. It's called HRNK, Human Rights for North Korea, and it's a Washington-based group that is an information clearinghouse that they use satellite information, Korean speaking researchers, and then they use the donations to commission reports and studies, and their website is full of great information, and it's often the most precise, it has more expertise and more details.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, One of the problems about running a totalitarian state in the satellite era is you can't really keep secrets about how your trade works or where your concentration camps are or the amount of electricity you're producing because it all can be monitored very precisely
Mm-hmm.
from above. And HRNK and some other groups do monitor it. The Trump administration has not focused on the human rights issue in North Korea at all.
Mm-hmm.
And Democratic governments in the United States tend to focus on it more, but not too much, actually. It's more the strategic issue of worrying about the nukes because a country that North Korea now is a important nuclear threat. And that's what the United States policy worries about, and the ability to deliver those nuclear weapons with long range missiles that cannot be shot down that could hit the United States. The thinking about where North Korea is in being able to deliver a nuclear weapon to California or Washington, D.C., is that they're not there yet, but they're getting close.
Mm-hmm.
And so
That's
that is the primary worry, and the human rights situation in North Korea is now, particularly under the Trump administration, totally secondary, tertiary issue.
that's really too bad. Um, yeah, I was gonna ask you if do you have a little more time, or do you need to
Sure,
get going? A little more
sure.
time.
I get
Okay,
one more
cool.
time.
So I was curious. I wanted to ask you, Trump in, I think it was 2021, he actually stepped into North Korea with Kim Jong-un, and they got all these photo ops
Right,
together. And
right.
um, you had said in an interview that America being the big bad guy is kind of what North Korea needs to sustain its narrative, to convince North Koreans that we need to build up the army so that we can protect ourselves from America. And so, um, I had curiosity of whether Trump's sort of more friendly approach would do any good. Did it or the opposite?
It doesn't seem to have changed anything. The United States, is almost always at war with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, threatening Iran, and wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, and going back to the Korean War, which started in 1950 and ended in 1953. Well, the entire existence of North Korea has one war, the war of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that war, to hear it from the Kim family orthodoxy, was started by the United States and it was won by Kim Il sung. Both of those things are false, but that's what North Koreans are taught to believe. And they also are reminded constantly that it was the American bombs that flattened North Korea, that turned it into ashes, and that killed your grandma and your great grandfather and all of this stuff. So they constantly remind the population that the American imperialist bastards, as they're called, uh, started this war, destroyed our country, and that the Kim family heroically saved North Koreans from imperial slavery. Uh, so that's a narrative that's very suitable for the continuation of Kim family driven totalitarianism. So they like that narrative. And Trump's strange affection for Kim Jong Un, calling him, saying that he loves him. He got a lovely letter from him, and shaking his hand and stuff. It 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 doesn't really. It's not consistent with the narrative that most North Koreans have been taught to believe. And Trump had very little follow up with North Korea, very little substance to go with his glad handing of an authoritarian leader. He has a proven affection for authoritarianism and for people like Putin. And so his glad handing with Kim Jong Un was more of a locker room chat among authoritarians than it was an effort to have a sort of comprehensive peace with North Korea, which would require, long-term, intelligent, deep, deeply researched diplomacy, and that isn't happening under Trump, and it really hasn't happened under other governments either. In part because China and Russia like the situation that exists now. And certainly the Kim regime knows that if there's an opening, a democratization of the country's political system or its economic system, that they are at risk of being ousted and murdered by people who are sick of living in a prison.
You mentioned the North Korea using the fact that America dropped bombs on civilians in North Korea during the Korean American War. Um, th that was that was so interesting to me. Your America came out not looking amazing in the biography of Kim Il Sung and No Kum Sok.
Well,
Um,
the reason for the American behavior in the war is that the Americans created a divided Korean peninsula.
mm,
Uh, and they created the puppet state led by Syngman Rhee, who was an authoritarian and who was constantly provoking North Korea. He wanted to control all of North Korea himself. He wanted to go to war and overthrow Kim Il sung and kill him and take over. Uh, and the North Koreans basically wanted the same thing from their perspective. Uh, and so the Americans, they created this monstrous problem by dividing the peninsula. And it in some ways it's the festering problem of not understanding what you're doing when you divide a piece of the world where everybody speaks the same language and it's
Mhm.
one people, and all of a sudden it's two countries
Mhm.
with two ambitious, rather murderous leaders.
Mhm. And there's like the flyovers and the bombing of soldiers who weren't in combat at the time.
Yeah, and the
And
Americans, when Kim Il Sung persuaded Stalin to support the invasion of South Korea, he worked on it for about 3 years and finally persuaded Stalin to give him enough artillery, tanks, um, but not air cover, not airplanes, and ammunition to start the war. So it started in 1950, and when it started, the Americans were caught with their pants down. They had basically brought home all of the military forces they'd sent to South Korea. There were only about 400 Americans in uniform in the country, and the South Korean army was completely outgunned by the Soviet-backed North Koreans. And so the first few months of the Korean War were one of the most embarrassing episodes in American military history. They were Americans were killed at a very high rate. Reinforcements were sent in. They very often were young soldiers from the United States would go to South Korea in 1950 and would be dead in a couple of weeks. Something like 37,000 Americans died, and most of them died in the first year of the war. And so the Americans were caught with their pants down. They were embarrassed. They had all these soldiers who were killed, and they had growing political questions about what the hell are the Americans doing in Korea because all these young men are dying. And so the Americans then responded by doing what they could do, which was they had a unlimited amount of trained pilots, bombers, artillery, I mean bombs for conventional bombing for bombing cities, and napalm. And so in the U.S. Air Force did what it was capable of doing, it was well trained to do, which was to systematically destroy every city and town in North Korea. According to some post-war analysis of bomb damage, uh, more than 90% of the structures in towns and cities were knocked down, and many towns were bombed into rubble and then napalm to burn the rubble by the Americans. And this was perceived outside of the United States at the time as a war crime. But in the United States, it was seen as a justified response to the aggression that started the war. But the
Awesome.
Kim regime has used that bombing narrative, the bombing and napalming and the killing of your grandma, as a reason for endless militarism. And it's sort of an apology for the general, deprivation of living in North Korea. They say, sure, we have problems with food. Sure, we have problems with technology. We have, the lights go out, but we're protecting you. We're using our resources to make our military strong so those American bastards won't come back and kill grandma again. And
Wow.
is an effective nationalistic tool for maintaining Kim family control of everything.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. Oh, man, that was kind of a curveball I threw at the end. But we can sort of circle back to our wrap up question here. Trump is um putting some tariffs on China, and we know that because of because of China that North Korea, maybe not their entire reason for still existing, but without China, it seems like North Korea would have trouble continuing.
It would be in deep trouble. But also now Russia is a new factor. Um,
Mhm.
Putin, there's lots of fuel available from Russia. Natural gas and diesel, gasoline, very important, and fertilizer,
Mhm.
very important for sustaining North Korea. And that pipeline is now open along with weapons,
Mhm.
rocket technology from Putin, which is a new shot in the arm for the Kim regime. And its trade with China has resumed after COVID. It basically stopped for a year or two, but now I've seen reports that it's close to 82% of what it was. This is the official trade that has resumed, and so North Korea does have its lifelines set up with with China, which is the main meal, but
Mhm.
now also with Russia and Putin, which delivers much needed fuel, military technology, and stuff. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah,
Because it's Russia was important in the beginning, and then for a while it wasn't for North Korea,
no,
and
I
now
mean,
it is again.
after Stalin died, Russia continued to subsidize North Korea, but increasingly, it was increasingly less important. And the Kim regime, after the war, after the Korean War ended, it changed, it rewrote history. It did not credit China or the Soviet Union with saving Kim Il sung's butt when he lost the war that he'd started. They just said that basically Kim Il sung was a genius and he won the war. Uh, and if you control all the information, you can say whatever you want. You can lie about anything. Um, that's a very important part of the system that they have is that people still struggle to get information from the outside world in that country. Although more trickles in because of technology, um, but still, most people uh, they buy what the Kims are selling them because it's the only thing that's on sale.
Do you think, given all that, do you think that Trump's tariffs on China will affect North Korea much, if at all?
No, I don't
No.
think.
Okay.
And Trump's tariffs on China are, very contingent. There was a court ruling yesterday that said that he can't do this. He doesn't
Hmm.
have the authority to do it, and he also has gone from 10% to 30% to 150% back to 30%. He's all over the map, and so it's very hard to understand the word uncertainty and tariffs and Trump is the way to describe it. And so I don't think this will affect at all China's relationship with North Korea or the economy of North Korea. North Korea is still subject to UN sanctions that are pretty drastic, although there's been considerable cheating by countries like India and Pakistan um, and other trading countries on those sanctions.
The insurance scams that you were talking about that North Korea did. I forget which book this was in, maybe Escape from Camp 14, but
Yeah,
that was just wild.
right. Well, they've been involved in retail fraud, in smuggling drugs, insurance scams, um, and I haven't seen too much new information about that. I think the way their exports include some limited agricultural stuff, some lobsters, things like that, and missile technology. They're a leader among small and medium-sized states in exporting missile technology, nuclear technology, and now in exporting labor to build things in the Middle East, in the Soviet Union, and to fight Putin's wars.
Wow. They just keep adapting to the needs of the time to
Yeah,
keep it as
yeah,
same as possible.
yeah.
Okay.
It's not a good way to run a country in the sense that people are very poor and malnourished and with rotten medical care.
Mm.
Uh, but that's not really the concern of the leadership. The
They
leadership,
just want to keep their power.
that's exactly it.
Oh, dark stuff. Oh, well, are you working on any other projects lately?
Well, I've shifted a little bit away from North Korea. I've written about the stories about the history of the Pacific Northwest, and
Mm.
I've just written a memoir, which I'm trying to sell.
Oh,
So
cool.
that's what I've been up to lately.
We'll keep our eyes out for that.
Okay.
Is there any other things you want to mention before we sign off that you want to leave with message with our
No,
listeners?
one of the things about North Korea that's really interesting is how totalitarian systems function. What are
Mm.
the levers they use? And when there's a threat to democracy in the United States, as I think there is now,
Mm.
uh, uh, authoritarians tend to use some of the same levers.
Mm.
They describe the press as the enemy of the people. They
Mm.
demonize foreigners.
Mm.
They try to delegitimize the courts
Mm.
and other independent um, universities.
Mm.
Um, big companies are forced to do the will of the leadership uh, or cease to exist.
Mm.
And by looking at North Korea, you can sort of see what happens when all of those things work and work very well and work forever, and the
Mm.
kind of life it delivers to the people who live under such a system.
Mm.
Um, and and then to value the things that keep a democracy alive, which is independent thought, free flow of information,
Mm.
free flow of international trade,
Mm.
uh, and vibrant research universities.
Mm.
Um, all of those things are important for a free society. And a lot of them are threatened in the United States now as never before in my lifetime. So
Mm.
that may be why North Korea is interesting and relevant to Americans.
Wow. That's really helpful because you have studied political implosion in depth in a number of countries. So you can kind of recognize the signs. And would you say you're seeing those kind of signs here of like potentially political implosion and
Yes,
mm,
the
that's
answer is
scary.
yes.
Okay. On that happy note.
All right. Well, it's nice talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, definitely check out Blaine Harden's three books on North Korea, his more recent work on the Pacific Northwest, and keep an eye out for his memoir. Um, we hope to see that soon.
Okay. All right. Nice talking to you.
Thanks
Bye.
so much, everyone. Bye bye.